Thanks, Eric, and thank you everyone for having me join this this morning. Let me just share my screen. Perfect. So I'm hoping you can all see my slides. Again, thank you all for having me. It's a real privilege to be here with you this morning. What I'm going to do is just walk you through what we call our digital readiness assessment, which is a UNDP tool that we've been working on with a number of governments around the world, most recently the Government of Curacao. And then also very happy in the chat and also in the lounge afterward to discuss more broadly the role of digital data and technology in development, in decision-making, and other aspects as well. So just to start with, I'd like to introduce what the Digital Readiness Assessment Tool is. So essentially at its heart, the DRA, or the assessment tool, is a rapid diagnostic to map a country's digital strengths, challenges, and opportunities. It's a resource to see where UNDP and other partners can best support governments, economies, and societies in kind of driving and accelerating their digital efforts. It's also a useful tool to kind of improve coordination as we work towards what we call a whole of government or a whole of society approach. And also allows countries and governments to kind of look beyond just policy and delivery to look at actually what digital means in the context of national and broader development as well. As you can see on the right-hand side here, the tool has actually been founded on a number of principles, from making it as easy to complete as possible, and I'll walk you through actually how it works in practice in a moment, to making it as actionable as possible to drive efforts and action, and also making it inclusive. And this also includes founding the Digital Readiness Assessment and all of its work on the Sustainable Development Goals, and ensuring that no one is left behind or excluded from the potential that digital can enable. We've developed the Digital Readiness Assessment founding on our whole of society and our whole of government digital transformation framework, which you can see on the screen here. This is a framework and a guide to support and collaborate with national digital transformation efforts, including identifying the components, foundations, and drivers needed to make digital transformation a success in any setting. And it's also a way that UNDP can support and collaborate with governments, not to replace or duplicate existing efforts, but to align, augment, and amplify the very important work that governments around the world are already leading. And most importantly, as well, as mentioned by Heinrich in the introduction, it's also founded on a number of principles. The biggest one is obviously about ensuring that digital inclusion is at the center of our work and that no one is left behind. So during the course of the Digital Readiness Assessment, we run through a number of questions around the 5 core pillars that we have on the screen here. So for example, in infrastructure, we look at what does and doesn't work in the context of digital infrastructure. So where can people access Wi-Fi? What does mobile data look like? Can people afford connectivity? How are people getting digital skills in the society? In the context of government, we look at which public services are online and which aren't. And we also ask your kind of favorite public websites, which is always an interesting question. On the third side around regulation, we look at what protections exist for privacy, security, and also broader catalytic things like open data. For business, we look at how businesses can function and operate in Curacao. And then for the people element, we look particularly at the digital divide and ensure that no one is left behind. And across all of these 5 pillars, we also ask some broader questions, including things like the impact of COVID-19, and also looking at kind of broader digital priorities as well. And then we take all of this data that we get from civil servants, from the private sector, from civil society and other stakeholders, and we combine it with data that we take from across the international development and the technology sectors. This includes data from our UN family, so the ITU is one example, or the World Bank, but also data from social media partners, mobile network operators, and others. And we also, where possible, look at data that we can get from government, whether existing analyses, reports, or even open data as well. And most excitingly, Curacao was the first country in which we'd also launched a large-scale public survey. You can see on the screen here a Facebook ad that we ran in collaboration with the government here. And this has become a really valuable source of data for the whole analysis and assessment. So I'm just going to walk you through a few slides about what the assessment means in practice, and then I'd like to wrap up with highlighting why it's so important for Curacao and for other countries on their kind of digital development journey. So all the data that I'm using here is not from Curacao, it's from another country, but I just want to use it as a kind of indicative and an example. So what you can see on the screen here is that this country has completed its assessment. We've taken data from the survey, we've taken data from other sources, and then combined that with multiple perspectives from very different sectors and from different perspectives. And it's landed the country very firmly in the kind of systematic column. So a country that is systematically applying digital tools, processes, and technologies in the context of their economy and broader development. But what this allows is we can then identify a number of interventions and actions where that country can solidify its position on that systematic level, but also accelerate its digital transformation journey to be more differentiating and potentially even transformative as well. So for example, what we do with any assessment is we disaggregate that headline score across the 5 pillars. And so you can see on the screen here that this example country has all the scores fit within a systematic column, from a lower 3.1 in the context of regulation to a higher 3.6 in the context of people. And this is obviously highlighting the kind of strong digital literacy elements that have been happening in this country. But then we hear from policymakers, so what can we do with this information? I'm just going to walk you through one quick example in the context of connectivity. So for example, again, here you can see that this country scored 3.2 in connectivity. But behind every single one of these boxes, UNDP, in collaboration with our partners, including governments around the world, we've put together a kind of menu of policies, legislations, innovations, and interventions that governments and their partners in the private sector, civil society, and elsewhere can start exploring and implementing in order to advance their digital transformation efforts. So for example, just to stay with connectivity for a little bit longer, a country that scores in the systematic level, we have a very long list of interventions that they can look at to solidify that position, but also to advance to the next step. So for example, you can see here, this is a number of interventions that we have around the policy area of connectivity. So for a country that is scoring as a kind of systematic country, it may want to look at a kind of national broadband plan to set kind of very kind of time-bound and defined targets to accelerate coverage and connectivity rollouts. We can look at data collection efforts to make sure that we can collect data on marginalized groups, particularly women and others in society who may not always have equal access to connectivity. And then often we hear in many countries that what stops the rollout of connectivity are issues with rolling out infrastructure, whether mobile masts or fiber optic cables. So one potential intervention could be, can we look at shaping rights to land legislation to ensure that people have their rights to land protected, but so we can also roll out critical digital infrastructure for society as well. And so for every single one of those 5 pillars and each one of the 5 stages, we have this long list and menu of policies, legislation, innovations, and interventions. And we take each government through these almost as a kind of checklist to strengthen their digital foundations and to accelerate their progress as well. And many of these can be shorter, kind of quicker wins. Some will happen over the medium term, and some are kind of longer term, multi-year efforts as well. And all of these have been designed so UNDP can support countries and governments around the world in their digital transformation journeys. I decided to quickly highlight a few examples in terms of where this is going as well. So for example, we've been running the digital readiness assessment across a number of countries over the past 6 months or so. One of the first ones to launch was in Dominica. And so far, the findings and the assessment has actually informed their national digital transformation strategy, which is now underway as a result of this work. In Grenada, we conducted a digital readiness assessment earlier this year. And as part of that, it's starting to inform a smart vision for the country as well. More recently, we launched in the Solomon Islands, and this work will also be hopefully informing the national digital strategy as a kind of very defined next step. And then in Curacao, we wrapped up the assessment just last month. We're phenomenally impressed with the response from government, the private sector, civil society, and also from the public through our public survey. And we're now working with the government to figure out what the kind of next steps look like in terms of building on that assessment. More widely, we have assessments underway in Samoa, in Guinea-Bissau, and others launching soon in Haiti, Maldives, and other countries as well. So I'd just like to kind of wrap up with highlighting and reaffirming why this assessment is so important, firstly for UNDP, but more importantly, for the work and the efforts of our partner governments around the world. So I'd just like to start with this quote from Satya Nadella, the CEO of Microsoft. So in an earnings call back in April 2020, which is obviously barely a few months into the pandemic, Satya highlighted that Microsoft had seen 2 years worth of digital transformation from its clients and partners over the course of 2 months. So more than a year later, that figure is obviously going to be much, much higher and even bigger. I think for us and our partner governments around the world, COVID-19 highlighted that digital transformation is not optional. It's fundamental to service delivery and citizen engagement, and to also enable things like remote working and remote learning as well. But the pace of digital transformation driven by COVID-19 isn't sustainable for any country. Instead, we need to maintain the direction, but not the pace. And this includes building on the digital foundations that many countries have already built, strengthening and refining those, and also finding other ways to leverage digital data and technology for national development and national growth as well. So even before COVID-19, digital and broader transformation was happening in the context of initiatives like the Fourth Industrial Revolution. This describes a kind of blurring of boundaries between the physical, the digital, and the biological worlds, including things like cyber-physical systems. So for example, how can we transform the physical environment through things like smart grids, autonomous vehicles, and similar. What we've also seen is that things like the Fourth Industrial Revolution have also had significant alignment with COVID-19, particularly in the context of this concept called the Great Reset. But it's also much broader. It includes things like the future of work. And all these elements can be very hard for governments to engage with, as they demand truly pan-society and pan-government and pan-economy efforts around things like skills, investment, incubation, and so on. And often we find that governments are also being judged against the best of the digital private sector, which causes real challenges too. And more importantly, we also see that there are many risks and challenges that governments are having to grapple with in the context of things like the Fourth Industrial Revolution and digital transformation more broadly. This includes privacy and security, regulatory catch-up with the private sector, automation, and so on. And also at the global level, we see a real importance for driving common standards and approaches to ensure inclusivity and also to guarantee that no one is left behind. We're also seeing a lot of work around emerging technology. AI is a big one. This is an example of some of the work of our UNDP India team. They're using AI to identify brick kilns that are flouting environmental regulations. So tools like AI and related ones like machine learning have enormous potential for a national country's development and to achieve the sustainable development goals. From improving efficiency by automating labor-intensive tasks, through to highlighting new insights and data sets that we couldn't previously analyze. But what we find is that AI isn't a homogeneous concept, and the policy, ethical, and other challenges around AI are likely to differ based on the type and application of AI. And even relatively benign and basic applications such as chatbots can even pose real challenges. And this includes policies around fairness and enforcement, and also ensuring that AI does not create, entrench, or exacerbate any digital divide more broadly. And again, as part of our work on the digital readiness assessment, it's identifying how countries can start engaging with tools and technologies like AI. Blockchain is another example of an emerging tech. A blockchain at its simplest is a type of distributed ledger technology. It's essentially a kind of system that ensures consensus and agreement around particular data. So blockchains can store information, but they can also digitize, strengthen, and automate processes. For example, things like smart contracts as well. What you can see on the screen here is a project from our team in Ecuador. They shaped the world's first blockchain shared value chocolate bar, which directly improved farmers' incomes by connecting consumers with farmers through the medium of blockchain. And again, for governments, this is a very broad area to engage with. It's everything from ensuring the equivalence of digital contracts and signatures, somewhere that actually Curacao is actually leading efforts, through to developing underlying data and systems and regulations, including supporting and driving entrepreneurship. There are also particular challenges and opportunities across sectors. For example, using blockchain to support vaccine credentialing in the context of COVID-19 response. And again, our work with the digital readiness assessment is to try and support countries in engaging with these kind of technologies. I'd also like to highlight that actually the Fourth Industrial Revolution isn't just about AI, blockchain, big data, and 5G. It's also about how other technology is changing lives and livelihoods. And one example is 3D printing. We actually led a big initiative last year around crowdsourcing global open source hardware innovation and taking it to a local level. And this focused on COVID-19 response, but founding it on things like 3D printing. So how can we build local supply chains, local skills, and local entrepreneurship? So the photo you can see on here was taken by our team in Tanzania. And so it really highlights that actually when we're thinking about technology and the digital economy, it's not just things like AI and blockchain and so on, but often more frugal innovation and also focus on entrepreneurship and skills. Another area that we touch upon in the digital readiness assessment is really trying to unpack the challenges being faced by countries, governments, and societies in applying technology, data, and digital tools in an inclusive and equitable fashion. Often what we find is that technology is not always positive, and COVID-19 has really made stark some very real and very challenging and quite scary challenges. So first is to recognize that often this inclusion challenge is broader than technology. This is actually from a study in the States where they looked at the learning outcomes of students who were studying from home during the start of the pandemic. And what it highlighted is actually those students who were most marginalized, so often coming from minority or ethnic backgrounds, did not have safe spaces to study from at home. They did not have access to devices or connectivity or quiet places to study in. And so actually their learning outcomes suffered as soon as they were taken out of school. So here this kind of highlighted for us that we need to be really focusing on beyond just technology, beyond devices, beyond connectivity, and looking at the kind of multiplier effects, both positive and negative, of the digital economy. Similarly as well is the kind of more formal digital divide and its impacts and its negative multipliers. So these charts are from our friends at UNICEF. On the left-hand side, you can see the very different levels of mobile phone ownership across a number of countries. And this is very important because increasingly governments and our partners as well, and also UNDP to some extent, will using tools like mobile phone data to develop policies and interventions to support populations. But the tricky aspect here is that if we're basing this on mobile data and not everyone owns a mobile phone or has access to a mobile phone, particularly women, then we're going to be designing policies that exclude half of society and could also actively undermine or entrench inequalities as well. So this is something that we need to be thinking about when we apply technology, is to make sure it's inclusive, and we're having a very kind of broad consideration about the whole kind of ramifications of this application. Another example is on the right-hand side, is the kind of benefits of really digging into the data. And it's a point I'll come back to in a moment. This is a chart that used actually mobile data as well to look at how COVID-19 lockdown policies were working or weren't working in Indonesia. And what it kind of highlighted is if we focus on the average, that yellow line, we can see that actually broadly policies are working quite well. About 50% of people are able to restrict their movements. But if we disaggregate this by income levels, we can actually see that red line, which is the poorest communities in Indonesia, are much less able to restrict their movements than their kind of richer counterparts in society. This is often because they were forced to work because they're part of the gig economy. They did not benefit from subsidies that others in society had. And their kind of informal and other kind of work practices meant that they couldn't restrict their behaviors. So again, this highlights the real importance of collecting equitable data, but also digging into the detail and not just focusing on the kind of high level snapshots either. And again, these are elements that we also try to draw out where possible in the digital readiness assessment. So what we're finding around the world is that digital data and technology are really crucial tools in development. As I mentioned, even prior to COVID-19, but now particularly with connectivity, public service delivery, and the future of work, they're really essential development tools. It's something that we're really engaging with a lot at UNDP, from digital public service delivery, like our chatbot project in Egypt, through to 3D printing that I mentioned earlier, but also leveraging big data in Bangladesh and India. And again, this highlights the real importance of Curacao engaging and leading in this new space. The digital readiness assessment data really highlighted increased technology usage across the country, including being driven by COVID-19. And so this is a really strong development and an opportunity to kind of build upon. And it's been very exciting to kind of hear many of the presentations that we've heard this week about the role and the potential for these tools in Curacao's development. I'd just like to highlight two broader points to kind of wrap up, to kind of tie together some of the other presentations that I've heard this week. The first thing is that often we focus on big data, and at UNDP we do a lot of work around big data. So we have a lab in the Philippines called the PINTIG Lab, which brings together epidemiologists, social scientists, statisticians, and others to inform policymakers on service design, policy response, and so on. And these tools have phenomenal impact and real importance in designing policies to improve societies and economies. But we also need to be thinking about lean data, which is actually something that our friends at an organization called 60 Decibels do very well. So lean data is essentially things like mobile phone surveys, call center surveys, and also getting out into society and speaking to people. So learning about the kind of data points and the lives and the livelihoods behind each bit of big data. And then the third thing that we talk about a lot is what we call thick data. And thick data is more qualitative. So it's things like observations, people's feelings, people's reactions and perspectives that kind of provide real color and insight into people's day-to-day lives. And all these elements we bring together as part of the digital readiness assessment. But for me, that kind of bottom right one, which are two questions we take from the assessment, is really important because digital and technology are essentially just kind of tools in our international development toolkit, but they're founded on the kind of needs and the realities and the perspectives and the aspirations of citizens as well. And so these need to be really kind of fundamental in any kind of assessment or engagement that we're doing. And then finally, just to kind of build upon that point, I'd just like to kind of highlight this quote from the Government of Singapore, which is where myself and my team are based. Singapore is obviously a very high-tech country. They were also one of the very first countries to release a contact tracing application called Trace Together. But even when they launched this tool, in all the kind of press statements and when talking about it, they released this quote, which essentially highlighted that Trace Together, even though it's high-tech, is not meant to replace offline public health or contact tracing efforts. It's meant to augment, to amplify, and to complement these physical and human-led efforts. And this is exactly the kind of perspective that we're looking to do with the digital readiness assessment, is to try to take this more holistic approach to digital transformation. It's not about 5G, AI, or big data, but it's about how these tools can support countries and individuals in improving their lives and their livelihoods. And that's what we're trying to get to with the assessment process and all of our work at UNDP, including in collaboration with governments around the world. So thank you all for your time. I'm very happy to pick up questions now in the chat, and I'll also drop by the lounge afterwards for more detailed discussion as well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Calum. So it's curious that you mentioned 3D printing as a response to COVID-19. Curacao has had some great grassroots communities answering that call for a shortage of PPE. So using 3D printing for producing personal protective equipment for first responders. Actually, we even took it a step further in collaborating with an organization that does plastic recycling. So they collect plastic waste, shred it into pellets, extrude it into filament, and that filament can then be used for producing PPE. So that means that we're also contributing to a circular economy. So it's a very nice example.
So, yeah, no, for us, it's a really important concept that it's not just high tech. It's fundamentally about how these tools can improve people's lives or just improve livelihoods as well. So great to hear that that's happening locally.
Okay. So we do have a few questions. One of them is if the baseline for the digital readiness assessment is a survey conducted on government entities and businesses. So assuming then that baseline does not include input from all socioeconomic sections of the population, wouldn't that be a biased start, or will it be supplemented with additional information?
It's a really good question. So we don't aim for the digital readiness assessment to be a representative survey. We do draw upon representative surveys in pulling this together, including obviously things like the ICT survey that Curacao has been running for many years. What we use this tool for is a kind of rapid snapshot and diagnostic of a country's digital readiness. So we draw upon perspectives from many different sectors, including the public, including the private sector, civil society, and government. But we don't aim for this to be representative. What we try to do is then bring in other sources that can provide that kind of broader perspective, including secondary data, secondary literature, and also existing representative surveys as well.
Okay, thank you for that answer. So one more question regarding Ecuador. Which blockchain platform are they using?
There's a lot we can talk about in blockchain. So we're actually about to publish a report that sets out the kind of the parameters and the guides for how countries can explore blockchain, almost as a kind of handbook or checklist. And we actually go into much more detail in the Ecuador example there. But one of our big partners that we work with is an organization called Convergence Tech, who are doing some great work with DLTs. So very happy to make a connection after this as well.
Okay, thank you so much. So a few more questions. What's going to be the next project after the digital readiness assessment? any predefined directions?
That is a question that's, I think, out of my hands. I think what we're doing, we've submitted our the results to the government. We've had a really positive dialogue with the government here, and I think we're just now waiting for actually discussions around what those next steps look like.
Okay. So last question, can you tell us more about No One Left Behind Digital Divide project in Curacao or in any other country?
Yeah, so this is obviously one of our biggest priorities at UNDP, and it starts with actually understanding who is most at risk. Often in many of the countries that we work in, even very high income countries, we have real gaps around identifying who are the most marginalized and being able to actually engage with them as well. So firstly, we have that kind of challenge around underlying data on the population. The second is always, and one of the biggest challenges we face is communication. How do we actively engage with these populations to make sure that they can engage with the benefits of digital and technology, but also we understand their kind of needs and their realities as well. The other area that we tend to do a lot of work around is increasing the relevance of these tools and technologies. Often if you don't have local content or relevant products or services, many people won't engage with them, which is more than fair enough. But if we can start building local content developers, start catalyzing local innovation ecosystems to start developing the kind of content that these kind of groups want to see, then that's often a very powerful way to getting people engaged with technology and its potential. And then further upstream, we do a lot of work with governments and others to build the kind of safeguards and the protections to make sure that no one is exploited or marginalized or excluded from this potential either. And that includes building in privacy and other safeguards into the whole kind of digital economy process.
Okay, thank you so much. So if there's any other questions, I would advise everybody to head to the lounge. We will ask Calum to have some minutes of his time in order to answer any additional questions you guys may have. So please make use of that functionality in the Hublo platform. Head to the lounge, grab a chair so you can pick his brain. Once again, thank you, Calum, and
Thank you,
hope to have you back soon.
Thank you, everyone.